economics of news media. And Connor will get us started.
What's up, everybody? Glad to see this great turnout today. We got a lot of people out here. Hopefully it stays that way throughout the semester. So as Eleanor said, we're going to be talking about the economics of news media and kind of an economist definition for media that we found during our research was that it's operators meeting the informational and entertainment wants and needs of audiences, advertisers, and society with available resources at the time. And a really important piece of this is the available resources. Why? Because available resources have been changing in the past 10, 100, and even thousands of years of how we can print and publish media. For instance, we can look at this graph here, and we can see that since Gutenberg and the printing press, to kind of the radio time up here, to the advent of the internet, those available resources have changed drastically. It changes how we give the media, how the different media operators will show us what we're researching, and also how we consume it. So going further into that, the internet shaped how the news is produced. It tells us who gives the news and also what incentives the suppliers have to give that news to us. And what we'll show with economics is those incentives have been skewed actually by the internet. And that has actually changed the quality of the news that we're getting today. So just to kind of expound some of the things that I was talking about, 64% of people say that they get their news from online sites. And this is around 2016. Also, 27% of people get all of their information from social media. Compare that to other print sources and newspapers, it's not very much. And also I talked about how different news media outlets have been changing because of these available resources. If you look at New York Times, the New York Times has 7.98 million followers. And that's definitely a different way to express what's been happening. So today we're going to explore news media in specifically, things like New York Times, and all the things you guys have probably been seeing on Facebook. We're going to do this through the lens of media economics, which is actually a subset of economics with a published journal and a page actually at the Pew Research database. So this is actually a pretty big thing, and that's where we got most of our data for this presentation. So if you want to dispute any of Jimmy's claims, you can go there and fight with him later. And why is this relevant? Well, today it seems like media almost has a derogatory term. It seems when people talk about media, they talk about fake news. And in fact, the President of the United States says a lot of different things on Twitter about fake news and how it has been, at this point, a total political witch hunt against him. And that kind of shows how fake news is kind of a subjective term, right? What is really fake has kind of changed. So to kind of expound this fact and why this is so relevant, why we need economics to kind of show this, we're going to play a little game. And it's called, is this fake or real news? And if you think that this news is real, I want you to raise your hand. So we're going to go on a little political witch hunt with Donnie and see which news is fake or real on Facebook. So with some research, I found this first article here. And this says, breaking! Pope Francis has backed Trump and released this incredible statement. Why? Spread this everywhere! And that's how you know, that's pretty good when it says that in the title of the news article. And this is by thedailypresser.com. What do you guys think? Is this real or fake?
Real. Fake.
Real? Yeah. Yeah, raise your hand if you think it's real. Great. You know what? This is actually fake. I had to look into it, but this is fake. The Pope did not back Donald Trump. All right, this is another one. This one I actually had to look into for myself. This one I wasn't sure. You can see. So let's read the title. We can kind of see some things if this is real or fake. Is it true? WikiLeaks reveals epic video. Bill Clinton having sex with Megyn Kelly. This is not how you spell her name, too. That's actually the wrong spelling of Megyn Kelly. So this is from the Free Patriot Post, and I think this was from the End of Fed, the Facebook page. So what do you guys think? Raise your hand if you guys think this is real. You know what, I thought so too, but this is actually fake. I clicked on it, there's no video there. Not a virus. So this one, okay. This one, Donald's pretty inquisitive, as you can see. This one actually took me a while. I had to do some of my own Googling for this one. Evidence. Hillary now confirmed to have Kuru disease. I did not look up what that is. From cannibalism. Proof. So they're saying that the proof is actually in this article. This is from the Conservative Daily Post, and Susan Munson liked this. What do you guys think? Is this real or fake? Raise your hand if it's real. Guys, I looked into this one. This is fake. All right, now last one. This one I found on Facebook also. Ben Carson defends himself against allegations that he has never attempted to murder a child. And he actually, in this post, he says that he did try to murder a child when he was younger. So what do you guys think? Raise your hand if you think this is real. Wow. Guys, this is a real news article. And that's just kind of a little demonstration of how much fake news has been infiltrating our media today. And you can't really tell the difference. So today we're going to run through this. We're going to talk about who is providing the media, so the different news companies, how they're structured and the revenues they gain, the issues ranging from collusion to the authenticity that we just saw with those different articles, and the economic theory to reinforce everything that we're saying. So in doing so, we're going to look at the demand side, and Jimmy's going to try to prove and hash out some of the things that we talked about.
All right, so I'm going to look at consumer preference and willingness to pay. So when it comes to consumer preferences, it's becoming increasingly mobile, and there's a lot of brand loyalty. So this is all from Pew Research, by the way, if you want to look it up yourself. But it's here it shows that most people get their news from TV compared to print, only at 20%, while TV is at 57%. And that number for 20% for print news has actually fallen from 7% in just the last 3 years. So it's going down increasingly quickly. And it's actually becoming much more mobile as well. So people more and more are getting their news on smartphones rather than even just laptops. So there's a lot of room in the market for apps. A lot of people get their news from New York Times now has its own app, or I know people that use apps that have where they send you all the news of the day from different sources, things like that. So it's becoming more and more like that rather than just going to a certain website necessarily. And it gets broken down by age as well. You can see here that when it comes to TV, the older you are, the more likely you are to get your news from television, and the younger you are, the more likely you are to get it from online sources. And this kind of makes sense when you think about the people, the players in the market when it just comes to well-known news channels. Fox News does have the highest ratings for their news networks, but also their viewership is in the older age groups. So it would make sense that more people get their news at that age from TV compared to, let's say, MSNBC, which is more liberal, aims for a younger audience, but their ratings aren't as good because mostly younger people get it from online news sources. So that's something to keep in mind as well. When it comes to attitudes, people will claim that only half the people in the United States will claim that they are loyal to their news source. People won't admit that they only get it from the same news sources. But when you actually look at people's behavior, it comes out that 76 turn to the same sources all the time to find their news. And these two stats on the side, they're kind of hard to see, but 46% of adults are the ones that are very loyal, that will admit that they go to the same sources and then actually do it, while only 18% of people that claim they don't actually don't go to the same sources. So only 18% of people in the U.S. Try to fish around in different news sources rather than always going to the same ones. So that's a lot to do with trust and maybe even some biases. All right, so what about willingness to pay? There's also generational differences here as well. And that's also to do with something called reference price. So older generations are more likely to pay for their news because they're used to paying for newspapers throughout their life before everyone got their news from online. And as a reference price is just that when you think about consuming something, you think, all right, is there any other thing out there that would give me the same good for a cheaper price, or what would I pay? And forever they had to pay for newspapers, so yeah, paying for New York Times subscription works. Now, younger generations, we have so much online free news that we can get. Our reference price is pretty much zero. We don't want to pay for news. However, they found that younger generation people that pay for Spotify or Netflix, since we're already saying I will pay for streaming TV or for our music, those people are more likely to pay for their news. So there is some room for growth there. And actually, one thing here shows that different countries have different willingness to pay. So the US is about 67% of people say that they wouldn't pay at any price. And the mean payment that they would pay would be about $8.40 a year. Does anyone pay that for their news now, or would be willing to pay that for their news in here? Yeah, only a couple people. Exactly. So can you guys think of any reason why that certain countries might be more inclined to pay for their news while other ones might not? Yeah.
Certain countries subsidize news, so they have their own public broadcasting and stuff people get news from.
Right. Yep, that's definitely one reason why. Anyone else have any thoughts on that? All right, one thing that I came across was that actually countries that in the past kind of controlled their news, so people didn't have access to a lot of independent news sources. Now that when they do have access, they are willing to pay, while here in the US, we're not as likely to pay because we kind of see news as something we're entitled to, that we should be allowed to get all of this independent journalism, whether it be that isn't run by the government. So that's also something to keep in mind there. All right, so with all that in mind, we'll move on to Eleanor, who's going to talk about some of the economic theory behind all this data.
So maybe you're wondering what's behind these preferences and trends. And to understand them, we need to know a little bit about news as a commodity. So first, Jimmy talked about how we increasingly consume our news on our online and mobile devices. And apart from this being a function of just having more computers and phones in our lives, it also reflects their advantages over television, print, or radio sources when we consume news. So if you think about it, television, print, and radio offer much less interaction with the news and with other consumers of the news than these online or mobile sources. And it's the difference between passively listening and watching to news and being able to tag or comment or share news. And so when you do things like this, you add something of value, hopefully, to the news itself that can be experienced by other consumers, and that enhances the value of news for them. So to borrow an economics term, this is called connected consumption. And it may explain why more and more of us will read news online or on a mobile device. Often we don't just get news, but we also get other people's opinions or interpretations of the news, which might help us decide whether or not we want to read or watch a video. And that brings me to my second point. So news is something called an experience good in economics. And if you remember, Connor told us at the beginning of the presentation that news is a way to meet information demand with available resources. So you, as a consumer, your resource is attention. And it's definitely a scarce resource because there's more news than we have time or the attention span to read. So as a result, you have to choose what kind of news you want to consume to maximize your utility. But the thing about news and information in general is that you don't really know how valuable it is to you until after you've consumed it. So you can see, when you buy food or clothing, sort of how high quality it is when you buy it. But with news, at most you get a headline or a blurb under the headline, and you really have to spend your time and attention to discover its value. So it makes sense in a way that we're not really willing to pay for our news because we don't know what it's worth. And possibly to overcome that problem, we consult the same sources over and over again. We avoid figuring out what's good and what's bad, and that leads to the brand loyalty that we saw in Jimmy's graphs earlier. So the last way in which news is different from your regular good or service is that it's a public good. Does anyone remember from Econ 102 what a public good is? Yell it out.
Low excludability.
Yeah, okay, that's one. And there's one more characteristic. It's called non-rivalry. So a public good is non-rival and non-exclusive. Non-rival means that if you consume it, that doesn't diminish its value for someone else. And non-excludability is the more important part for news. And that's because you can't prevent people who have not paid for the news from consuming it. Even if news is bought on a pay-per-item basis, it can be spread easily. And the benefits of news or information in general are really hard to quantify. So to give you an example, a reporter might do some in-depth research on a public issue that's relevant to everyone. They might write an investigative report and the report gets published, and that, with activism, leads to a change in laws. And that change in law, the benefits from that change in law will spill over to lots of people who never read their article or never pay for their article. And furthermore, the benefits can't really be priced in earlier. So economics teaches us that this kind of journalism is going to be undersupplied in the free market. And we'll return to that issue later in our presentation of less than optimal quality journalism. But for now, we're going to have a small discussion. So
if we look at kind of a simple graphic here, this is kind of what's pushing this entire industry. For instance, if I put something like Hillary Clinton's a cannibal or something like that, Viagra is really going to want to have their picture on that page when I click on it, and they're going to pay a lot of money in order to do that. And that's kind of how the structure works. The more attention that I can grab, and it's easier for me to do that, this circle is going to work really well. But let's break down media. Let's break down and see really who are these people. So there's content producers, there's aggregators, and there's distributors. So the content producers would be like your typical news show, the people who are putting out the information. Your aggregators, which are like the cable networks, MSNBC, and then your distributors, cable companies, Comcast, Time Warner, things like that. And the primary sources of cost for all these companies in the media industry is content creation and production. You can imagine that news shows are very expensive to make. Journalists get paid a lot, high-end journalists, and it also costs a lot to make a movie. These guys are all in movies also. And if you look in here, Comcast programming and production costs is more than half of their total operating costs. And this isn't really normal in an industry for this to happen. So this kind of makes a story. There's high fixed costs and there's few industries. Why? Because it's super expensive. So the thing that a company does is creates an oligopoly and vertically integrates all these different parts to make it cheaper. And this kind of proves that this happens in the industry. As one company can be a content producer, an aggregate, and a distributor. And this happens a lot. For instance, GE owns Comcast, which owns NBC. And we look further into this, this is a solution of choice. There's 6 large media companies that own 90% of what we read, watch, and listen to. So if you think about that, there's not a lot of executives that are running everything that we look and see. So for instance, GE, here's GE, they own NBC, and they also own Comcast, and you can look at some other news stations here. Wall Street Journal, Disney owns ABC, that's kind of interesting, and Time Warner, CNN. They own every single part of production, and that makes it much more cheaper for them and much more available, in a sense, for us. So to kind of look more into this and look more into the costs they incur and look deeper into this industry, Jeffrey's going to cover the revenues and costs.
Thank you, Colin, for your brief overview of this supply side.
You're welcome, Jeffrey.
Yeah. So I'm going to dive deeper into Connor's topics of the content producers, aggregators, and the distributors. So the U.S. media industry is made up of the companies that create content and distribute the media content. And the value chain starts at the content producers, such as television producers and film studios. They create the original content, and then they make money by selling those rights to the content to the aggregators. And then aggregators such as broadcasters and cable news networks, then so they buy the rights from the content producers by third parties, and then they package those acquired content and then program it to schedule and transmit the content. And then lastly, the distributors provide the infrastructure through which the media is pushed to the consumers. And then in television and radio, distributors include Comcast and satellite TV, and then the distributors sell these bundled channels to the consumers at a subscription fee, monthly subscription fee. And as Connor said briefly, the media is very vertically integrated, and all the the 6 large companies are a media conglomerate. So why do media vertically integrate? Well, the primary costs of the media industry is content creation and production. From this little Comcast chart, we can see that a majority of their operating costs is from directly programming and production costs. And other impacting factors for these programming and production costs are such things like licensing fee and just transmitting the content to the consumers. So the high fixed content costs result in the economies of scale for the larger conglomerates, and also this gives significant bargaining power to the content producers who are these media conglomerates. So now that we see the costs of all these media producing, we have to see how they make money in revenue. So media industries make revenue because they're industries, and industries exist because they make money. So if you think about it, if there's millions and billions of users times by the zero fee that they pay, we could think essentially that there's no money being made. However, we have to think about that if we are not viewing the product, that we are the product itself. The transaction for the media companies is renting our consumers' eyeballs to these advertising companies, which leads me to my first point of advertising. Advertising is the main source of revenue for these media conglomerates. They advertise and they offer the content for little or no cost, and the advertisers want to promote their products by selling it to the media conglomerates, and then those media conglomerates put those ads on the website via by the banners on the side or the video interactive advertisements for us to experience. A second stream of income is subscriptions. Subscriptions are a great media revenue for media that is continually being updated. Subscriptions are popular because they provide a steady stream of income over time. And then the media news is a commodity because they have little or no cost. And then, therefore, when we think about subscriptions, we should think that they offer a significant value over the general news sources that we Google because they're free. So, like, for example, the Wall Street Journal or the Economist should offer a little more insight because of the subscription fees that we pay. And finally, the pay per item is the least significant source of their revenue. Pay per items work because they offer individual packaging or just like one-time views or one-time articles. So for example, like paywall, they offer, paywall is when you see an article for like, you see half the article or video for like 2 minutes of a video, and then to finish the video or to finish the article, you have to pay for that content. And Pew, in 2010, Pew did a research about would consumers continue to use their favorite websites if they had to pay for their content, and 82% of the surveyors said that they would look elsewhere. So now that, I just want to quickly talk to your neighbors again about what are the possible...
Well, this industry is quite concentrated, as Connor had alluded to, but as you guys probably discussed, it might raise some questions. Does that mean it's not regulated? To answer that, we got to go look through our history. So, of course, first of all, the freedom of the press is also importantly inscribed in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. But then for about 150 years, not much happened with media law until 1934, when President Roosevelt enacted the Federal Communications Commission, largely on the premise of making, quote, rapid, efficient, nationwide, and worldwide wire and radio communication services with adequate facilities at a reasonable charges available to everybody. And so that remained in place for a number of years, just kept the industry afloat, kept it fair, kept it free. By 1983, there were a number of competitors in the media market, over 50 of them. But all that started changing a year later when President Reagan here signed into law the Cable Communications Policy Act of 1984, which for the first time deregulated the cable industry. So no longer in place were prohibitions on mergers between the big conglomerates, along with restrictions on how much they could charge, and that remained in place for a number of years. And we saw during that time the industry starting to consolidate a bit. You see some firms coming together. Then in 1992, there was an attempt to keep it deregulated, but as you see here, the Congress overrode President Bush's veto, and the industry once again became re-regulated, so those prohibitions on the mergers came back into place, and all kinds of anti-competitive behaviors are once again prohibited. But that only lasted for 4 more years until Slick Willie Clinton here signed into law the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which once again deregulated the industry. And this is where a number of our modern problems start coming into place. The Telecommunications Act, it permitted media cross-ownership, so these big conglomerates, now they could merge once again. It also increased the percentage of local television and radio stations that the bigwigs could own. It went from 35% to 45%, so you bought them all up, and now you see all your local TV stations that are affiliated with Fox or affiliated with NBC. Along with all of this, this act strengthened the barriers to entry into the media industry. So it extended the length of broadcast licenses from 5 years to 8 years, made it harder for smaller competitors to get them. And it also just gave away barriers to entry to the bigwigs. These digital television licenses, they could have been very lucrative had they been auctioned off, but instead they just were given out for free to the major media conglomerates. The little guys stood no chance. So that brings us to 2005 then. These companies are allowed to merge once again. We get down to 10, just only 10. The industry is becoming more consolidated. And now we're here in 2017. Like Connor had said, we're down to 6 major companies. And so that really prompts some question. What does the FCC do now? Not much, apparently. As we can see here, when it comes to anti-competitive behavior, the FCC only adjudicates on a case-by-case basis after the fact. And they really push for self-regulation within the industry, hoping that the major media companies comply with antitrust law and the principles behind them. So with all this said, are there any problems? We all still get fabulous shows. We can watch, anything we want on television, basically. Get any sort of news we want. But are there any consequences? And for that, my man Cameron's going to come tell us some more.
So we're going to look at some of the issues or some of the market failures that happen because of the market being so consolidated. And one of the issues that we have, or one of the first ones that we think of, is low quality news. So since there's so much news coming in and it costs so little to produce the news, you get a surplus of, well, we don't actually know if there's a surplus because there may be a demand for, fake news. But we do get a surplus or a great amount of low quality news. The next thing we realize that we get is tabloidization. Tabloidization is like really a big word for moving from factual news to really sensationalized news. So seeing the things that Connor had in the very beginning with the real and fake news and trying to discern between the two. And then you get a lot of misinformation. So you don't have to be an experienced writer to write a really sensationalized piece. And this helps proliferate the spread of misinformation. So, to conclude, we're going to have, what's his name? Jimmy. We're going to have Jimmy conclude, so.
Thank you. All right, so now we've gone over the history of the news media, the supply side, the demand side, regulations involved with it, as well as issues. Kind of just want to take away that technological change has led to a change in cost structure of the news industry, which has then led to a change in quantity and quality of news being supplied. So with all that in mind, we're going to have some discussion questions. Let's do this as a whole.